So thank you, Kathy, for reading that. These quotations that Kathy just read, they are 200 years old. And truth be told, I'm really not sure just how many of you may find them inspiring. I read these words, and I can feel the anger coursing through the centuries. They aren't happy, expansive, luminous words. They don't allow me to wade gently through my abstract ideals. They are forceful, blunt, and yet they call to me in a very visceral way. And that's probably because I was raised on food stamps and love. From a young age, I understood the sleepless anxiety of factory layoffs. I watched my father navigate round after round of layoffs with military service. And when I was ready to graduate high school, the only way that I really knew how to pay for college, despite being on the honor roll, was to go into the military myself. Now, when I found Unitarian Universalism nearly 20 years ago, in the midst of that military service, I fell in love with this faith the very first time I heard the words, "Whoever you are welcome here. Whoever you are, whoever you love, you are welcome here." Those words, they drew me in and converted me into a shiny new born-again UU. I grew up being teased by my school-age peers for being poor. I was told I should be ashamed of my family's poverty. And I grew up hearing from Christian peers that my atheist father was going to hell, no matter what, and I should just accept that fact and turn away from him, no matter how loving of a father he is. So those words, "Whoever you are welcome here," they meant everything to me, and they still do. And as a working class woman, UU coffee hours have sometimes been disorienting. Some conversations left me feeling a little out of place. Little comments about occupation. Assumptions about lifestyle and finances. And sometimes subtle looks of hesitance after learning a person doesn't have a college-level education. More than once, I've heard comments used that associate poverty with lower intelligence, and heard that used as a reason why poor and working class folks sometimes don't fill a UU congregation's pews. These conversations left me feeling unmoored in a sea whose depths and horizons I truly love. Who was I to swim in this ocean? Who was I to be part of this faith? I don't come from engineers, from scientists or doctors or philosophers or educators, as so many of my UU friends do. I come from factory workers, from coal miners, from dock workers. My grandmothers, they didn't participate in the second wave of feminism because they were busy working as low-paid seamstresses and in grocery stores. And I'm not ashamed of that or any of the ways that my family survived. Yet I still found myself asking, where did I fit into this religion that has so much elite history? Now, I'll be honest with you all, I was still considering this question when I entered a UU seminary. Let me just say, that is a very expensive question to be asking when you go into seminary. But luckily, I found the answer while doing research for a class on the 19th century prophetic history of Unitarian Universalism. And that answer was to be found in the history of one of Philadelphia's Universalist congregations. According to the unparalleled labor historian Philip Fauner, the Second Universalist Church of Philadelphia on Caldwell Street hosted what could be considered the very first ever labor speech. And it was given by Universalist congregant William Hyton. And he did so much more to craft the birth of the labor movement as we know it today. He and the Universalists, the Quakers, the freethinkers around him, they created the first labor newspaper written and edited by laborers, the first cross-trade labor union, and what is judged by some labor historians as the first labor political party in the world. Seriously, we can arguably claim the birth of the labor movement as part of our denomination's heritage. Now, when I found that out, I had to wonder why Universalism wasn't more known among labor folks today. Even Philip Fauner, the aforementioned peerless labor historian, he lamented the way that William Hyton had been forgotten and his movement had been forgotten, this movement that was built within the pews of the Universalist congregation. But William wasn't alone among the Universalists to lead this movement. Both of Philadelphia's Universalist pastors of the time, Stephen R. Smith and Theophilus Fisk, they actively supported the labor movement's efforts. They served on various committees for these efforts, and consequently, they found their sanctuaries completely overflowing, standing room only on Sundays because of their efforts. Now, the words I found reading through the Mechanics' Free Press, the voice of this early labor movement, shocked me. The 19th century labor movement is often portrayed as racist, sexist, xenophobic, and just downright problematic. And that was sometimes true of what the labor movement would become later in the 19th century. But what was birthed in that little Universalist church on Caldwell Street was something different. In our reading earlier, you heard snippets of how these men and women thought about the state of the world around them. They saw themselves in solidarity with Blacks who had been enslaved by wealthy Southern oppressors. In other articles from the Mechanics' Free Press, which we just don't have time for, there was actually a wildly popular serial author who reads more like a working-class superhero, and he goes by the moniker the Nighthawk. Yes, the Nighthawk. The Nighthawk was something of a disguised vigilante who protected the vulnerable poor Philadelphians from hypocritical clergymen, from wealthy, leering gentlemen, and from those who emulated the dastardly Southern enslavers or who attacked individuals merely for being Black. Now, I'm still waiting for a comic book with the working-class, feminist, anti-racist Nighthawk superhero and his trusty sidekick, the Screech Owl. I promise I am not making this up. Maybe we'll get it one day. And it wasn't just the masked vigilantes who expressed remarkably progressive views 200 years ago. There were editorials decrying the removal of the Cherokee and insisting that the Native nations have a right to self-determination and to the land that they have occupied from time immemorial. There were editorials decrying corporal punishment for children as brutal and inhuman, demanding that the militia system be abolished, and there were editorials criticizing laws that criminalize poverty while favoring the wealthy. There were even editorials about women deserving equal wages with men. And they garnered financial support for women workers when they went on strike. And perhaps even more remarkable were the passionate defenses of someone named Fanny Wright, who is a radical proto-feminist. Now, if you don't know who Fanny Wright is, I hope you'll take some time this week to look her up because she was an absolutely amazing woman. Ms. Wright held incredibly controversial opinions for her time period. And honestly, many of them stayed controversial well into the 20th century. Fanny Wright didn't only advocate for things like free public education, women's suffrage, the abolition of slavery. She also advocated for birth control, sexual freedom, legalized interracial marriages, and remarkably liberal divorce laws. I don't know about you, but those aren't the kinds of things that I had heard 19th century working class whites were supportive of, but they were. This localized movement quickly spread across the eastern seaboard. Working men's parties cropped up in dozens of cities, as did new cross-trade unions and new labor newspapers. These new unions supported each other across trades when one would go on strike, and for the first time, they began to collaborate in their fight for shorter working hours and demanding an end to child labor and instituting free public education. They instituted new debate societies and libraries for the working classes to better themselves, and they did so much more. I'm convinced that Universalist theology was intricately linked with this active take on solidarity, this solidarity that completely characterized Huyton's vision for the 1820s Philadelphia labor movement. For Anne Lee Bressler, the famous Universalist Reverend Hosea Ballew's vision was essentially communitarian, and in that view of humanity lies the seeds of empathetic solidarity. Bressler names Ballew as challenging the Unitarian tendency to lean into an Arminian individualism, which implicitly reinforced a sense of social hierarchy. Instead of individualism and hierarchy for the Universalist, the ultimate ideal in our day-to-day world was to unite in human brotherhood. Unlike some Unitarians of the time period, these Universalists were less likely to seek refuge from modern society and communes or hermitages. Instead, they sought to change society through their real, concrete actions that could improve their everyday communal lives. Where Arminian individualism often led to sympathy and disinterested benevolence, Universalists were instead led by a passionate conviction of the interrelatedness with all of humanity. Hosea Ballou was well known to the readers of the Mechanics' Free Press. His sermons, his speaking engagements, and tracts were frequently advertised in its pages. And the more I research, the more I see how interconnected this early labor movement and Universalism were. In our reading earlier, we heard workers refer to the institution of slavery as being labor by force and by fraud. Around this same time, Ballou preached these same words verbatim. Ballou said, "It is a deplorable fact that in all ages and in all countries, ministers of religion have been much prone to the love of power. They work towards improving their many advantages and gaining an ascendancy over the common people while securing the confidence of the populace. It is not natural for men to wish to be slaves. They never would be if they were not decoyed into it, either by force or by fraud. Whatever false predictions were wanted for the purpose of deceiving the people, the false prophets were ready to predict. And the priests stood ready to take advantage of those deceptions to bring the people into entire submission to their measures. Perversion of the greatest of blessings produces the greatest evils." Reverend Ballou went on to say that all this deception is carried on for the purpose of obtaining the people's money. Money, they know, is power. By it, they are persuaded that they can control the concerns and affairs of state. Now, the analysis I read here in Ballou's sermon, it mirrors what William Huyton said in other areas about the role that clergy play in upholding systems of inequality. When I read the yellowed, aging pages of the Mechanics' Free Press, I see workers unflinchingly naming the trials and oppressions they faced. They didn't argue that their cause was the only one. They saw themselves in solidarity with other workers, whatever their race or gender. Their enemies weren't individuals with little power who may or may not say problematic things. Their enemies were those benefiting from an unjust system of oppression, those who felt they had too much to lose if every American was to finally enjoy equal life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In these laborers' visions, the so-called promise of Columbia, of the Revolution, was a vision of true equality in the base material reality of every living person in the United States, whatever their race, gender, or age. Now today, the Poor People's Campaign, or PPC, continues this struggle. As automation grows to levels only dreamed of by William Hyten and his contemporaries, the need for labor only continues to diminish in value, something they foresaw. Today, there are over 140 million poor and dispossessed in America, and the majority of those are children. Now, if you're unfamiliar, the original PPC was created by Martin Luther King Jr. And while quotes from King's "I Have a Dream" speech often get the platinum treatment here in America, there's actually a quote he started using far more before the end of his life. He said, "What good does it do to a man to eat at integrated lunch counters if he can't afford to buy a hamburger?" Before his assassination, King saw the ways that racism, poverty, and oppression, both at home and abroad, work together in society to entrench the gulf between a very small few at the top and the vast majority of us left down below. This system of inequality causes working class folks in America to join the police forces, the military, and then it shapes our thinking to see our global and local neighbors as our enemies. In my past work with the Poor People's Campaign, I was blessed to meet many amazing, fierce organizers and activists from across the country. And friends, I am so happy to say, Unitarian Universalists, we righteously show up in droves in the PPC. And this work spans across all lines of division. You cannot separate racism from classism, or classism from homophobia, or homophobia from sexism, or sexism from transphobia. Dr. King later in his life saw that each of these prejudices were tools of distraction and control. The system is working as intended. The way I see it, we are living in an era that is hungry for the lessons of our Universalist forebears, where too many of us struggle to afford even a basic apartment on mediocre pay or Social Security, where too many of our family and friends are dying from a lack of adequate health care because their multiple part-time jobs don't offer insurance. I'd like to paraphrase the prophetic William Hyten once more. Poverty is a moral evil. It is a moral choice in our society, the choice to allow some to live in opulence and luxury, while others suffer hungry and homeless. The truly faithful cannot turn their faces away from these evils and pretend as if they don't exist. There's anger here, but the way I see it, there's hope here too. Hope exists when we refuse to turn our faces away from our shared suffering. There's hope when we unite in solidarity. There's hope when we uplift that faithful cry against oppression. I see hope here because we, the people, recognize the strength of solidarity, the power of our numbers, and the hope of a faith-filled call to justice.